Okay, I think. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Anu Basu, and I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at San Jose State University and director of the Silicon Valley Center for Entrepreneurship at San Jose State, and we are the co-hosts of this evening's event. We host our events in collaboration with the student-led Ideas Club of SJSU, and I believe Amer, the president, will be joining us and helping to screen the questions. The purpose of these speaker events is to inform and inspire our students and aspiring entrepreneurs, and to help all of us gain valuable insights into what's happening in the world of entrepreneurship and business from distinguished speakers like the ones we have with us this evening. This is the fourth and final event in our speaker series this semester. We've leveraged the fact that we are all sheltering in place to invite many distinguished speakers. We've had Steve Blank, the author and serial entrepreneur, followed by Charles Hudson, who is the managing director and founder of Precursor Ventures. And then we had Julian Guthrie, an entrepreneur and New York Times bestselling author, in conversation with Marcia Dasgo. And then this evening, we have Andy Cunningham, founder and president of Cunningham Collective, speaking with Young Han. Before I proceed to introduce Young, who will be moderating the discussion, I'd like to thank my colleague, Professor David McFeely, for inviting Andy to speak with us this evening. So Young and I met about 8 years ago through a mutual friend. And I remember she emailed me saying, I met this amazing speaker. The students love him. And guess what? He's a San Jose State alumnus. And she knew that I'm always looking for San Jose State alumni who can be role models and mentors for our students. At the time, Young was the CEO and co-founder of Go Volunteer, which was one of the largest volunteering networks in Northern California. And it's been wonderful to see his career evolve since then. So he's started more than half a dozen businesses. He has had 2 exits. He has helped hypergrowth startups like Phil's Coffee and Limelight Health scale through 3 rounds of funding. And at the same time, he's been an active volunteer at San Jose State. He has been a guest lecturer, regular guest speaker in our classes. He's mentored our students. And so that's been absolutely wonderful. So I discovered that Andy and Young were connected on LinkedIn. And so I invited Young to moderate this session. At the time, he was the founder of Forever Young Agency, a business consultancy. And so imagine a surprise when 2 weeks ago, I discovered that he had joined Cunningham Collective as head of operations. And so that was really a fluke, just, happened to be a coincidence, but a really good one. And I'm really happy that Andy and Young are going to be speaking with us this evening about 6 things that every entrepreneur should know in 2021. And so with that, Young, over to you.
Thank you so much.
We have till 7 o'clock. So after your Q&A with Andy, I'm sure we'll have questions from the audience, and they can include their questions under the Q&A or chat. And so we can then have an open session.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and pin Andy's video so everyone can see her. And I think oops, sorry, let me just pin Andy. I just pinned myself. There we go. So I can just make sure everyone can see Andy. And I think we're basically ready to go. So what I'd like to do is, first off, thank everyone for being here. And I'm really excited to be able to moderate this fireside chat with Andy. I'm not really sure how to best explain the serendipity of it, but there's more than the fact that I actually ended up joining a Cunningham Collective and working for Andy. it's also that Andy is a huge idol and a role model for me personally. And it's been one of the most amazing experiences getting to work for her and then eventually being offered a position to work for her formally. So super excited to be able to now get to moderate and interview her. She has some of the most amazing life experiences, both personally and professionally. And I can't wait to unpack that with you guys. So with that, I will start, but I would love to just remind everybody that you can start dumping your questions into this little Q&A widget that's in the Zoom link on the bottom. And I will, after my set of questions, open it up and cherry pick a handful of those so that way we can get some of your questions to Andy directly answered from her at the end of this session. So just a friendly reminder to use that little button to add your questions in there. All right, so without further ado, let's hear about Andy. So Andy, how are you doing tonight?
Hi, Young. I'm doing great, and I have to tell you all that Young is an operations genius, and I'm very fortunate to have him. So this was a really interesting serendipitous situation that we wound up in this thing together, but where I'm super glad that we are, and I'm really glad that he is working with me. So it's awesome.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And especially for me, it's really great that you're getting to spend so much time with SJSU Spartans because it's near and dear to my heart as I'm a Spartan myself. And I graduated from SJSU and I actually started my first business while I was a senior at San Jose State. So there's a very, very personal story that comes to you giving back to my alma mater here. So I really appreciate that. And kind of talking back to tracing to origins, I'd love for you to start by sharing your professional journey with the students here, because your start to being this multiple entrepreneur, preeminent voice for positioning, all the amazing things that you've accomplished in your lifetime has actually been a very, very interesting journey, right? I mean, it wasn't a straight line is my point. And I'd love for the students to hear a little bit more about your journey to your amazing accomplishments that have gotten you this far. So if you could walk us through your professional journey from college, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. So thanks. I will try. I tried not to take too long. I'm old, so it could take a while. It's been a long journey. Anyway, I went to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and I graduated with a degree in English literature, wanting to be a writer. I figured that's what I knew how to do. So of course, when you're that age, it's very hard to get like a fancy writing job. So I got the best writing job I could, which was writing for a magazine called Fleet Maintenance and Specifying. Woohoo! So excited. I got to write about trucks and lubrication and fuel and other things like that are really important in the world of truck maintenance. But they didn't pay very well, so I had to have a second job while I was doing that job. And my second job was as a roller skating hostess at a restaurant called Sally's Stage. It was back, all of you are way too young, but your parents will remember the urban cowboy days. And during the urban cowboy days, there were all these bars that were kind of Western-y, but they were kind of fancy Western-y with everybody had to wear fancy hats and cowboy costumes. And this place had a stage where they had country and Western music playing. Live music, and I skated people to their tables. So that was my second job. But pretty soon I got tired of working at the truck magazine, and I ended up wanting to make a little bit more money. So I ended up getting introduced to a headhunter or a recruiter person who looked at me and said, "You should be in PR." And I thought, why would you say that? I hate PR, and I hate PR people, by the way, because they kept calling me all the time at the magazine wanting me to write stories about their tools and their fuel and their oil and all that other stuff. And it was just really annoying. So I was kind of annoyed and I almost didn't go on the meeting. He set up 2 meetings for me, but I decided, oh, what the heck, I will. So I ended up meeting with 2 PR firms. One was called Burson Marsteller. The other one was called Edelman. And I ended up walking in the door at Burson Marsteller and fell madly in love. It was in the middle of downtown Chicago. I was on like the 12th floor. It was this big office that was very, just, I don't know, it was like watching, your dream kind of just open up in front of you. And I didn't really realize that I would like business so much, but I could feel it in the building. And anyway, took a job there. Which was great. They offered me a position and they gave me all of the technical accounts because I've been writing about kind of technical stuff. So that meant I got thrown in 1981 to the group that was doing what little technology there was back then in the day. And this was in downtown Chicago. But one of the accounts that I had was Bell and Howell. Now, some of you may or may not know the name of that company, but it was a company, it is a company that makes educational equipment. They were making projectors back then. Nobody uses really projectors anymore, but they do other stuff. And they were the only company ever to license the Apple name or the Apple computer. So they licensed the original Apple II, and they took the Apple II was a beige colored computer. All computers were the same color back then. They were this ugly, stinky beige color. They took the beige cover off and they put a black cover on it, on top of it. And it was known in the industry as the Black Apple. And it was the educational computer that Apple distributed it, but so did this company, Bell and Howell. And lucky for me, my client at Bell and Howell gave me one of these computers. And I took it. Now remember, we're talking 1981 here. This is a very long time ago, before the Macintosh was introduced, before the IBM PC was introduced, before any of this happened. And I brought it up to my office, and the librarian that we had there was intrigued with it. And she and I spent hours and hours and hours trying to figure out what you can do with one of these things. And literally, it took over our lives. We literally explored every possible thing you could do with a personal computer in 1981. And my boss kept putting articles about Silicon Valley on my desk because he noticed that I was really taken with this computer. And one of those articles had a picture of Steve Jobs on it, the cover of Time magazine. And I thought to myself, oh my God, it would be heaven to work in Silicon Valley. And as it turned out, my company opened up an office in Silicon Valley, and I had the opportunity to go and fly out to California and interview with that office. And here's a piece of advice for you kids, if this ever happens to you. Don't just take the one interview, take every minute you have of extra time and get more interviews, right? So even though I was being paid to fly out and do one interview, I took my extra time and got interviews with 5 or 6 other agencies. The last one of the day was an agency called Regis McKenna. And literally I got to meet with Regis, the founder of the agency. That's one person's name, Regis McKenna. And I met with him, and at the end of the interview, he offered me the job to launch the Macintosh for him, which was amazing. And I never would have had that opportunity if I had not taken it upon myself to do these extra interviews instead of just the one with the company that I worked for. So I quit the company I worked for, moved to California, got the job of launching the Macintosh for this company, which I don't need to tell you that working with Steve Jobs, I'm sure we'll have a bunch of questions about this, but it was a 24/7 job of high stress every minute of the day. But I got through it. We launched it. The launch was a huge success. And then Steve got fired from Apple 2 years later. And so I decided I'd never see him again. So I'll start my own public relations agency. Literally 2 weeks into starting my own firm, Steve called and said, I need help. I'm launching my new company today, and I'm having a press conference in my backyard. And it was 20 minutes before the press conference. Can you come and help? So I went over to his house in Woodside, California, and true to all the stories you hear, there was no furniture in the house. It was just him sitting on the floor of his kitchen with 7 people sitting around him. And one of those people was his lawyer, but the other 6 were people I knew from Apple. And he looks up at me, I'm standing and he's sitting. He looks up at me and he says, okay, I'm going to launch my company today. And I'm going to talk about what we're going to do. And I'm going to talk about all these people here that I'm taking from Apple with me. And I'm going to tell the world what a jerk John Sculley was. John Sculley was the man who fired Steve. He was the president of Apple Computer at the time. And I looked at him and his lawyer, and I'm agape. I'm like, what? You can't do that. You just start, you don't even have a product. You haven't even incorporated your company. You haven't really separated yourself from Apple. You can't tell the world that John Sculley is a jerk. You just can't, these are all things you can't and shouldn't do. And he sort of folded his arms and he goes, okay, all right, I won't do it today, but you have to go out there and get rid of everybody. And by the way, there were about 50 business press reporters from major publications like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Mercury News, all of these things out there. And I had to go out there and tell them all to go home, which was not a pleasant task. But it was the beginning of my next relationship with Steve, where I was able to work with him again to launch that company next when we were ready to do it. I also got the opportunity to launch Pixar, which was an incredible opportunity. And of course, once I had Steve Jobs as a client, it was pretty not that hard to grow the business from there. So I grew my PR firm, my little PR firm, into a relatively large company. I had about 250 people and 7 offices. And I sold that many years later to a London-based marketing communications roll-up company. And just to fast forward a little bit, I bought back the strategy division of that firm and launched another marketing communications company called CXO Communication. And that was really wonderful because I was in a non-compete with the company that had bought my company. So I couldn't do public relations anymore. But so I started doing brand strategy. And I did that for 8 years and sold that business to my partner. And then I started to work with a couple of other clients kind of on my own. And I ended up founding the company that I have today, which is the one Young works for, called Cunningham Collective. And we started off doing mostly positioning, which is the high-end strategy part of a marketing equation. And we did that we're about 9 years old, and we did that for the first 8 years. And about a year ago, we started doing the execution or the activation of the positioning strategies that we've done. So over the course of my career, I've worked with, I don't know, probably thousands of high technology companies. I've launched categories, I've launched products, I've launched CEOs, I've dealt with crises, I've kind of dealt with all of it. And I feel really fortunate that I've had such an amazing journey to Silicon Valley. So that I'll stop talking, Young, and you can ask another.
Oh my gosh. I every time I hear this story, I find like 7 or 8 different things that I have like flag in my mind to ask you about later on, because there's like so many more new things that you've done that I get to hear about, and there's not going to be enough time for me to ever learn all the cool stories of all the different amazing things that you got to do. But I do want to ask a couple questions about Steve, because I think that's one of the things that people love knowing more about, because he's such an enigmatic character.
Sure.
And you have this kind of infamous moniker about being the person that's been fired more times than anybody else by Steve. And I think it's a kind of a funny saying and a funny title to have, but it's also a very humbling and kind of a cool little moniker to have at the same time, right? I'd love for you to kind of talk to the students about that. Like, you know, what was it like working for Steve, and then what was it like getting fired by him so many times, and why did he rehire you, and just all of those things that go with that?
Well, Steve was particularly difficult to work with. I know everybody's heard that story. He was extremely demanding. He was not very nice. And if you didn't add value to him in the moment, you were basically out of there. So he went through these, and he was very emotional. So he went through these sort of phases where he wasn't getting what he wanted for whatever reason. And then he would just like disband whoever it was. He would dismiss whoever it was who was around him at the time. So the first time he fired me, I thought he wasn't even specific about it. He just basically said, I said, "Why are you firing me?" He goes, "Because your work is shit," which was a typical statement of his. And I said, "What work?" He said, "It's all shit. It's just shit." Sorry about that if I'm not supposed to say that on in class. But anyway, so I was pretty devastated, and I left his office, and I got in the car, and I started to cry, which I don't do very often, by the way, but that was devastating. And there was devastating, of course, personally, because getting fired is never fun. But the other thing was I had just started my agency, and I had a payroll to make, and I owed people money who worked for me. And once you're in that kind of a position of responsibility, it's a much bigger deal when you lose your source of revenue. And so I had lost my source of revenue, and Steve owed me $35,000, which is always a lot of money, but back then it was a real lot of money. So I would have missed my payroll and my rent if I didn't get paid from him. So I got home, and I called up my old boss, Regis McKenna, who had worked with Apple and Steve long before I ever came to Silicon Valley. And I asked for his advice, and I said, "Steve fired me today, and I guess that's all right, but basically he owes me $35,000, and he's refusing to pay it. What should I do about that?" And he thought for a minute, and he said, "Well, if you're going to work with Steve Jobs like that, you have to have something over him." And I said, "Well, what could I possibly have over Steve Jobs?" And he said, "Well, you have your relationship with the business press," which was true. I had an outstanding relationship with all those people I made go away in his backyard that day. I had built a great relationship with all of them. And I immediately understood what he meant. So I got the chief financial officer at Next to get me a meeting with Steve. And she happened to be A, a woman, and B, a friend. So I was able to get her to get a meeting for me with Steve on the calendar. I show up at the meeting. She's sitting next to him in this big conference room. And I say, "Steve, you owe me $35,000 and I need you to pay it because I have payroll to make. And you never mentioned a word about the work not being good enough until you decided that day to fire me. And so I need you to pay me for the work that I did. And he said, I'm not paying you because it wasn't worth it. And I said, Steve, and this is where the Regis strategy comes into play. I said, Steve, I currently get about 35 to 40 phone calls a week from business press reporters asking what kind of a guy you are to work with. And I currently tell them very nice things. And that's all I said. He stood up, went in the back room, got a check, came out, wrote it to me for $35,000, and then rehired me the next day. So
that's amazing. I can't help but say that that's a wonderful story, and it's so fun to hear these minor details that you never get to hear about in the larger scheme of Apple and Steve Jobs. But I do want to continue on that thread of one more positive Apple story here. I'd love to know what your proudest Apple moment was.
So my proudest Apple moment was, as I mentioned before, so this other woman who was working for me at the time. So when I joined Regis McKenna, I didn't mention this before, but the entire Apple account team had walked out like 2 weeks before. They quit. They all quit. They had just launched a product called the Lisa computer, and you may or may not know this from history, but the Lisa computer was a $10,000, back then, that was a lot of money, giant computer that basically failed immediately. And believe it or not, it's buried. The inventory they had is buried in the state of Nevada. They had to dig a big hole and bury all of their inventory, and that's no lie. So the team was just very, I guess, demoralized, and they quit, all except for this one young woman who was a year younger than me, and I was pretty young, by the way. I think I was 26. She was 25. So I got there, and she and I together wrote the entire Macintosh launch plan, and Regis never even looked at it, by the way. He trusted us to do it. I don't know why, but he did. We presented it to Apple, and they basically asked us if we needed any more money. So we put a certain budget in there, which I thought they would never go for, and he's like, how much do you need? So we basically were able to write this launch plan. So we executed the launch plan. And at the end of it, when we finally did the day of the launch, which happened on January 24th, 1984, I will never forget that day. We were at De Anza College is where we actually did this. It was a big shareholders meeting. The whole thing happened. Everyone was in tears in the entire audience because it was such a moment. It was such an emotional moment. And after it was over with, Steve walked up to me and he said, "Thank you." And believe me, he never says thank you. So that was my proudest moment.
Amazing. I love it. And I do want to switch gears a little bit because I think that it's also good for students, and especially because there's a mixture of a lot of entrepreneurship program students here, to also hear about the failures that had happened at Apple. And I'm sure that like it's all not glitz and glamour. I mean, what we know of Apple today is near perfection, but I'm sure that there's a ton of war stories that go on behind the scenes, and especially during the inception days. And I'd love to hear you share some of those things, that one or two things that you think Apple could have done better or messed up on during those growth phases, during those inception periods.
Sure. It's funny. Everyone remembers the Macintosh launch as being a huge success, and the launch itself was. And in fact, if anybody has time after this is over with, you might want to check out the 1984 ad that really really embodied the whole rebellion spirit that Apple was all about. And it is to this day known as, I think, the best ad ever developed.
Yep.
And so we launched the product with that ad playing at the Super Bowl on January. I don't know if it was January 24th, but anyway, whenever the date the Super Bowl was, we launched that ad. So it was huge. So the launch was a big success. The ad was a big success. It's taught in schools today. I mean, you might, if you take an advertising class, you will absolutely study that ad. And it was on every publication. It was on the cover of over 100 magazines. I mean, the launch itself was huge. And so everyone remembered it, but the product itself didn't sell. And this is a very interesting situation because that's not usually the case, right? Usually a launch, if a product isn't successful, the launch gets forgotten, right? Well, what happened was the product, Steve was trying to position that. So this is a lesson in positioning, right? Steve was trying to position it as another business computer. He wanted to get rid of IBM. he wanted to displace IBM in the market, who had what was called the IBM PC back then. And there were no other personal computers, and he wanted to displace that. Thank you. Somebody dropped the ad in there. You should definitely look at that ad, guys. It's unbelievable. So anyway, he wanted to displace IBM, and so he started to talk. He wanted to talk about the Macintosh as a replacement business computer, but it didn't have any of the functions that a business computer needs to have. For example, you couldn't connect it to anything. It didn't have a cursor key. You couldn't print from it. There were 100 product problems that made it not useful as a business product, but that's how he kept positioning it. And so it wasn't selling. It just wasn't selling. We sold way fewer than anybody ever thought. And Steve so believed in it. He wanted to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. And finally, Apple was funding all of this Macintosh, stuff with sales from the Apple II. So if it weren't for the Apple II and the success of that product, the Macintosh wouldn't even exist today, because it funded all the mistakes that Apple made on the Macintosh before Steve finally got it right. But what ended up happening is Steve kept pushing for it, and it was very expensive to keep this going. And Apple wasn't making enough money to keep it going. And there was a big hullabaloo in the boardroom between John Sculley and Steve Jobs. And in the end, Steve got fired. And he got fired because the Macintosh really wasn't selling. And so that's when he started Next, and when I ended up working with him again. But fast forward 8 more years, and Steve had been through his own failure, because Next failed as well, by the way. And he learned a lot, and he always wanted to go back to Apple. I knew that the day that I started working with him at Next. I knew he was going to go back to Apple, because it was something he had to prove. He had to prove himself to himself and to everyone else that he could make it work. So 8 years later, he was a lot older. He was 28 when this happened. No, 30. He was 30 when this happened. And then 8 years later is when he went back to Apple. And by then he had matured, he grew up, he figured out how to make the Macintosh a success. So it was hanging on by a thread through all those years. Apple was hanging on by a thread through all those years. And then he came back and put his magic to it, and the thing became a big success. So
Wow.
It was, the other thing I want to mention, which is a complete tangential comment, Young, is that I probably never told you this, but Steve threw himself a 30th birthday party, and I got invited, which was a huge honor that I got invited to this party. And you know who he had singing at his 30th birthday party? Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He was a big fan of Ella Fitzgerald, and she was alive back then. And so we got to see Ella Fitzgerald perform at Steve's 30th birthday party, which was amazing. So I just remembered that, and I wanted to mention it.
That is such an interesting choice. I never would have pegged that. That's amazing.
Yeah. No, he was
So
very
cool.
interested in that kind of thing. He was a very eclectic guy.
Yeah. Very, very, very unique. I would not have picked that name, even if I was thinking about it for an hour or two. Thank you for sharing that little nugget with us. That's awesome. I do want to kind of segue from those learns, because I think those learns really helped you form what is your book and your framework and your thesis that has kind of driven you moving forward to be the preeminent voice for positioning as a craft and as a focus. And I'd love to talk to you about your framework that you came up with, and the book that Dr. Feely leads his students through, as well as the book that I encourage everyone here to check out. It's called Get to AHA, that Andy Cunningham wrote. And it's all around positioning and this concept of the 6 C's. And I'd love for you to just kind of share with the students what the 6 C's are, to you, and what they mean and why it's so important, but also share like what kind of helped you craft this understanding, like drafting this framework and building this framework and really cracking this nut for so many companies, even beyond Apple.
Sure. Well, thanks, Young. So yeah, So the concept of positioning was actually invented by 2 guys in the 1970s. Two management consultants who's focused on marketing, named Jack Trout and Al Reese. And they wrote a book back in the 70s called Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind. And it was really the first time anybody had ever paid attention to this practice of positioning. And of course, this was written way before the internet. And so really the only way you could do positioning back then was through advertising. So the book was largely about how you position yourself in using advertising as the tool. But essentially, what they talk about there is positioning is the art and the science of creating real estate in the mind of your customer and your potential customer, which is still a very good way of describing it. So if you fast forward to when I started doing this positioning work, I was very intuitively good at it. My boss, Regis McKenna, was really good at it. And I knew it was all about creating real estate in the mind of your potential customer. But I did it all intuitively, like almost everybody else in the world who does positioning. They do it, they typically do it very, very intuitively. So I'd show up at one of my clients, and I'd be given the problem, and I'd interview a bunch of people, and I'd go home and think about it for a little while, and then I'd come back with this answer, I called it, and it would be like, ta-da, here's the answer. And nine times out of 10, the client would go, wow, that's really cool, awesome. But so I was in trying to sell my services to a software company one time. And the CEO was a new guy. He was a finance guy, not a software guy. And he was very financial engineering oriented. He did not have a lot of creativity or imagination. And he asked me this very simple question: how do you come up with the answer? And I was stumped. I had no idea how to answer it. I didn't. It's like, well, I just do, it's just what I do. And he goes, well, if I'm going to pay this much money to do this, I need to know how you're going to do it, and what are the steps you're going to take. And I thought that was a pretty fair request. So I went home that weekend, and I did lock myself in my office for a couple of days. It was pouring down rain. And I reverse engineered what I do when I do this positioning exercise. So it involved me looking at hundreds of companies that I'd worked with over the course of the last 15 years of my career. And I started by just sort of I wrote down the names of every company on a little piece of paper. I laid them all over my desk, and then I started to kind of cluster them. It's almost as if I were a computer application, right? Clustering these things with similarities. And by the time I was done with this clustering exercise, there were 3 piles on my desk. And there was one pile where the companies were all super, super focused on their customer. There was one pile where all the companies were super, super focused on their product. And then one pile where there were a bunch of companies like Apple, where they were trying to change human behavior on a fundamental level and change the world. And so I began to sort of study the different companies in there. And I came to this conclusion that they measured success differently. They hired people differently. They trained people differently. They even talked about different things in meetings. So I realized that one of the big things that I do when I go about this exercise of positioning is I actually determine which of those 3 kinds of companies my client is, because it creates authenticity in your marketing. Because if you're a customer focused company and you try to market yourself in some other way, you're going to fail. So I kind of recognize this idea that you had to market yourself authentically with who you are. So I thought about this. I came up with this idea. I called it corporate DNA. I came up with nicknames for them. I call them mothers, mechanics, and missionaries. And then I ended up writing a book about it. But basically, it's about figuring out what your corporate DNA is before you do anything else. So that's one of the 6 C's. I call that core. What is your core? It's your corporate DNA. And that's always a fun exercise. It's like doing one of these Myers-Briggs tests, if you've ever done one of those. Well, imagine if you're a company doing a Myers-Briggs test for your company. It's just as fun, right? You open up yourself and you put yourself out on the table and you go, oh, I'm this, I'm not that, I'm like this, I'm like that. And it's really a fun exercise. And it really, truly does inform the way that you should do your marketing, because it's consistent with who you are. And the example that I like to give, which I think is in the book, Steph Curry's an unbelievable basketball player. And Steph Curry has the DNA to be a great basketball player. That's largely why he is a great basketball player. Of course, he takes advantage of it and practices it and everything else. But what if Steph Curry decided, 10 years ago that he didn't want to play basketball anymore? He wanted to play the piano, but he couldn't play the piano. But he said, I'm giving up basketball and I'm just going to play the piano now. You'd be like, what? How could you possibly give away that talent and try to do something you have no talent for? It's the same with a company. If you have the talent to be a mother or a focused company, one that's really focused on your customers, that's what you should do. If your focus is much more about product, like Microsoft, for example, then you should do that. So anyway, that sort of informed this entire exercise. So the core is one of the 6 things that you have to do. And then what I realized is that's not enough, of course. You have to look at the market as well. So the other 5 things are, you have to look at the community that you're serving, which includes your customers, as well as those who influence them. So my insight on this was, it's not just about your customers, it's about who influences your customers, because you have to influence the influencers. And by the way, the influencers in my world are not the paid ones on Instagram. Okay, those are not bad, but you do have to pay them. But there are other influencers. You know, like if you're going to take a new vitamin, you might want to ask your doctor about it. Your doctor is an influencer to you on that purchase of that vitamin. So anyway, your community is one big thing we look at. We spend a lot of time examining that. We also look at the competition. That what does your competition say about themselves? How are they positioning themselves? And the reason we do this is we want to find a white space that is different from the way your competitors are positioning themselves, because what good would it do for you to position yourself exactly the same way as your competitors? Then you're not differentiated, then you don't stand out. So we spend a lot of time on competition. The next one is category. In the world of technology, there are a lot of people and companies who want to build or develop a brand new category. So we talk a lot about how you do that and what's involved. But you also might want to lead in an existing category, or you might want to create a subcategory. So this whole topic of category becomes a great big discussion when it comes to positioning a company. And then there's context. There's a lot of waves, cultural and technological waves, that you can ride to help boost your positioning along. And there are also waves you want to avoid, because they're either yesterday's waves or they're not big enough for you to ride. So it's just like surfing. You got to find that right wave and get on it just as if you were surfing. And so that's a critical piece of it. And then finally, the last C is what we call criteria, which really is, I just make our clients write down what's going to make a perfect positioning statement, so that I know in the end that we've succeeded. So it's really just sort of a check and balance situation. So those are the 6 C's: core, community, competition, category, context, and then criteria.
Thank you so much for sharing. And just to make sure that we further, point that out, is that, like, these are the things that you absolutely need to have. And as I've been working for you, and even before this, reading your book, it's been like a really great guiding post and guide rails for me as I, do operations, start companies, or do marketing or anything. Like, there's so much more power to this than people even realize. I think that sometimes people too often just think of this as a marketing effort, or right, or a branding effort, or a identification effort, but it's not. What you're talking about is like the core of a company. Like, you're really talking about a personification of a company. You're talking about things that impact things much bigger than marketing.
Absolutely, Young. You're so right. It's a filter for your whole business. Yeah.
Yeah. And can you talk to us a little bit about that? I mean, I think that there are so many stories that you have, because you've worked with some of like the biggest brands. Like, I learn about new companies that you've worked for like almost every week. And it's like mind numbing, because there's like not a company that you haven't touched that we just take for granted, right? But I'd love to know of a company that you could share with the students that you had to really focus and help them change their positioning statement, and got to that aha moment for them, and was able to make something like, just a great example of how positioning was able to permeate through their entire company.
Sure. So my favorite example happens to be an old one, but I hope you know the company is. I hope everybody knows the company Cisco. Everybody knows Cisco. So it's obviously a hugely successful company today. I had the great opportunity to work with that company many years ago, when John Chambers, who just retired recently as CEO, but I worked with him when he first got the CEO job there. And he actually had heard about us, and he came to me and he said to me, I run this company called Cisco. It was much smaller then too, by the way, as you can imagine. And we make hubs and routers. That's what we do. And I have this feeling that we can stand for something so much more than that. And I have this feeling that if we stand for something so much more than that, our valuation will go way up. And I said, wow, that's pretty interesting strategic thinking that you've got there. And he said, do you think you can help me figure out what that is that we should stand for? And I said, yeah, that's exactly what we do. For sure, I can help you figure that out. So this happened to be in the mid 90s, when the internet was just peeking its head out of from behind the curtain, right?
That's
And
right. I think Wi-Fi was just coming out to like
exactly,
the consumer.
just coming
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
Exactly. So we saw that as a contextual wave to ride, because what do you need to make the internet work? Guess what you need to make the internet work? Hubs and routers. You need hubs and routers or your internet ain't going to be working. So we ended up positioning Cisco as the company that could help you take advantage of what we called the internet economy. So we coined that phrase, believe it or not. And the minute we coined it, it was all over the press because everybody realized it was going to be a new thing. So we coined the phrase internet economy, and then we positioned Cisco as the third leg of a stool that makes the computer industry work. So there's hardware. Back then there was hardware, and that was pretty much represented by Intel, the semiconductor company. There was software, which was pretty much represented by Microsoft back then, as a software company. And then we put a third leg in there, and we said there's a third leg of this stool. It's called the internet, and that's represented by Cisco. Nice. And so we called Cisco the Internet Economy Company. And this just took off like wildfire. And there's some case study stuff in my book about this. John was super gracious in letting me write about it and giving me a lot of credit for increasing the valuation by billions of dollars of his company. And this is really what did it. We repositioned that company from a hub and router, essentially a plumbing company, right, to one that stood for the brand new economy that was in front of us today. And when you do this stuff well, and you have a CEO like John Chambers, who was amazing, you can pull off the most amazing miracles. So that's my favorite positioning story.
And that's something that I actually didn't know either. So that's really great. Now I learned another new story, and I'm like so amazed again because I didn't realize that you were part of coining that term. That's like a standard terminology that we use.
I know. I know it's good. That's why this work is so much fun, because you can see these waves happening and you jump on them and you can name them, and you can take maximum advantage of them. That's why context is so critical, right? What if we'd ignored the internet when this happened? It never would have happened. So anyway,
I'm gonna do a little hop back and forth. I'm gonna ask you one more question, and then I'm gonna open it up for some student Q&A here. And then I'm going to take back the control and ask two really fun questions to close us out. Okay. So hang tight, students, and please take a moment to add your questions in, because we'll start tackling you guys' questions here just in a minute. But before we go into the student-led questions, I'd love to ask you, what advice do you have to an entrepreneur starting out or on the fence about starting something right now during the pandemic, given the current climate and state?
My advice to an entrepreneur starting a company?
Yeah.
I think you have to believe in yourself. That's probably the most important thing, because trust me, no one else will. For a long time. No one else will believe in you for a long time. So so you got to believe in yourself, and you're going to fail a whole bunch of times. And then if you're lucky, you're going to succeed. And at some point. So you got to give yourself time. It's a journey. It's not a destination. We all want that big exit for sure, but really it's about your life in the journey on succeeding or failing. And it's the stuff you learn along the way and the people that you meet that really, really do matter in the end.
Oh man, it's beautiful. I love that answer. And I think that's one of it's so hard to explain to people, because when people ask me, why I joined Cunningham Collective and why I joined to work for you, it's actually that answer.
Oh.
Given the fact that you've accomplished so much and you've worked with such titans of industry, yet the thing that you care about the most about is, being happy in the journey. It's very unique and refreshing, and especially being a Silicon Valley native and having been hustling my entire life trying to get that sunset money, right? And it's really interesting perspective, because you've literally rubbed shoulders with titans of industry, and that's the answer that you give. It's really, really cool, Andy. Thank you for sharing that with the students.
Thank you, Young.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into some of the student questions, and then so students, again, please feel free to jump your questions here into the Q&A section as I'll try to work through it. So Andy, your first question is from William. It says, it sounds like working with Steve was pretty stressful. What about it made you agree to work with him again and again?
Actually, that's a really great question, William. You know, when you have an opportunity to help someone change the world and they want you to help them, you know, I don't know how you can turn that down, regardless of what kind of person it is. And that's, to me, that's the beauty of Silicon Valley. It's about changing the world. And I had that great opportunity, and I knew that he was changing the world. And so we all, it wasn't just me, believe me, there was 100 of us. There were 100 people closely involved in the Macintosh, and every one of us felt the same way. We just knew we were helping him change the world. So
That's a great answer. Yeah. We have one that's anonymous. What was your biggest failure, and how did you overcome that in your professional career? Wow, they're really hitting hard, Andy.
God, I've had so many failures. I'll tell you about a failure I just had recently, if you want to hear about
You're still
Young knows this one. So we got hired by a medical device company making a COVID-19 quick rapid test. And what an opportunity, right? This is another change the world company, right? It was the first one doing this kind of thing. And we put all of our heart, all of our emotion, all of our energy into this. We did all the positioning for them. We ended up creating a position called personal PCR. I won't get into all of this, but PCR is the most reliable testing that you can have. PCR lives in a lab and 50 by 50 feet, and you have to do it in a lab. And this company figured out how to miniaturize it and take it from the lab into your hand, to the palm of your hand, and you can do this thing at home. So it's pretty miraculous. And I failed with them because we gave them too much to chew on too fast, right? So we did the positioning, which they loved, and they still use it now. But we got fired from them too, because the plan that we laid out for them to execute against this was too much for this startup company to swallow. It was too big, too fast, too much. And I take responsibility for that, because I wrote the plan, I presented it to them, and it was just too big for them to swallow. So, and I'll tell you the lesson from that is, and by the way, this is about the 18th time I've learned that lesson. So I hope it's the last time. But here's the thing, when you're working with anybody, whether it's a human being or it's a company or it's a professor, you have to understand what the parameters of that person's ability to suck in what you're doing is, right? Like, what is their capacity to actually understand what you're saying, do what you want them to do, pay for it, whatever those things are. So like when you're working with, if you're working in a situation like I am, where I'm an agency and I'm working for a client, you have to take into consideration the amount of money that client wants to spend with you. And if you don't, you can hit it way on the wrong side of what they think is reasonable. So we gave them a budget of, I don't know, whatever it was, $4 million or something. And I think he was thinking originally $500,000. And so it was just too much. And so he fired us. So we got fired. So yeah, I fail all the time, by the way, all the time.
I love that you chose something that's so recent, because, typically I think we would have expected you to share, a memory from a distant past to show.
No, I keep failing all the time. Yeah, you well know.
I love that you did that. Yeah, that's really great, because I think it's case in point to the entrepreneur's journey, and someone such as yourself, being able to accomplish these accolades. And something that I get to see, intimately now, day to day, is that you're successful because you're willing to fail. And I think that people sometimes forget that, because from the outside perspective, they only see your successes.
Yeah,
and,
that's
I think
true.
It's really important for students to realize that, you can't win if you don't play.
Absolutely. And that was a big Steve Jobs thing. It was fail fast, get the failure over with, because you're going to fail. So do it fast.
That's an amazing answer. Thank you for that. The other question we have here is, what are a couple of things that corporate crisis communication people can do better right now, you think?
Crisis communication is a very interesting business. It is the business of preventing the crisis in the first place. So if you do it well, you're not actually in a crisis, and you do that by really great planning and being very straightforward and honest with the outside world. The honesty is everything when it comes to a crisis. Any CEO who tries to hide the fact that whatever it is, the product doesn't work, the product was recalled, someone died, whatever it is, if you try to hide it, you're toast, especially in today's environment. And yet over and over and over again, CEOs try to hide what actually happened. So if you're going to be a really good crisis comms person, you have to be a warrior for the truth, and you have to be able to speak truth to power. And if you can't do those two things, that's the wrong business for you.
Thank you. This one's a good one from Daniel here. He says, what do you think the next big industry is?
Well, I think it's going to have to do with artificial intelligence. We are at a stage right now where AI is and machine learning is in most of the things that we are doing, but it's at a very low level. It's like we're dealing with kindergartners with our AI, but pretty soon we're going to be dealing with high schoolers and then college students and then post grads, and so that's just going to be integrated into everything. So I think AI is really the big thing, but that has a lot to do with every industry, right? So we've got what is being called the urban air mobility market, which is these vertical takeoff and landing autonomous vehicles that are going to deliver packages and people all over the place, or little robots on the street that are going to be delivering packages on the sidewalk. It's just this AI thing goes into every industry that there is, and it's the biggest thing. But just so everyone knows, we've been talking about AI since I got into this industry in the early 80s.
Right.
So it may seem like it's new to everyone. It is not new. It's just getting better.
That's awesome. That's actually a really good point because it has been being talked about for quite a bit. I'm going to skip around a little bit just for time's sake, because now we're getting a lot of questions. Oh, this one's a good one. Since it's a big community of entrepreneurship students here, she says, thank you for sharing your knowledge. This is Nima, and says, how would a startup position themselves to be visible to customers in a competitive market? I think this question is mostly around like, how do startups that have limited resources do some of this positioning work?
Yeah, it's just hard work. You have to look at the landscape that you're in, and you have to map, if you can map it out and find that white space on the map. And by the way, my friend Steve Blank, who I know spoke to you guys, and I used to work with Steve. He's a wonderful guy. He created a way to look at your competitive map that I think is really excellent. He calls it the petal diagram. So he basically makes a picture of a flower, essentially, with all these petals on it. And in each petal is a category of competitor. So you cluster all of the companies from that category into that petal, and you figure out that, and the flower gets as many petals as there are potential competitive categories. And then what you do is you make one petal blank. Okay, you make one with nothing in it, and then you say, how do I get it? How do I create a petal here for myself? So that's
cool.
really, that's how, and that was from Steve, and he's a brilliant marketing guy, a brilliant startup guy, and it's all about differentiation. I'll just put it in one word. It's about differentiation.
Nice. I think that's a really great succinct answer for anybody trying to create that edge in a startup or a business. It kind of goes into another question that another student asked named Adrian. Adrian's asking, can you elaborate just a little bit more on the process of creating a category or a subcategory?
Sure. So creating a category is really hard. It doesn't happen very often. And when it does happen, you've got to realize that a category means there's more than one of you, right? There's no such thing as a category of one. So if you're going to create a new category, there's going to be other people in it, and you want those other people in it because that's what a category is. But categories are generic names. You don't ever trademark a category name, and it's very expensive and it takes years. And most of the people who try to create a category, and I've been involved with many companies trying to do it, fail. And it's like the third or fourth or fifth or sixth company into a category that actually succeeds. And I can't even think of a category where that isn't the case. Airplanes, computers, electric cars. Do you know how many years we've been building? I mean, Young, you might know the answer to this, but how many years have we been building electric cars in this country? 100, right? About 100.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
Tesla was not the category creator.
I was actually going to say Facebook as well. I mean, there was at least I think it was called like MySpace, and then there was Zynga. There was all these different platforms before Facebook actually really took off.
Exactly. So the lesson is, if you have an idea for a new category, and it really is a new category, you're probably better off letting other people get into it, watch the mistakes they make, and then jump in later. So that's my advice about new categories. Subcategories are a slightly different thing. Subcategories are, well, a great example of a subcategory is the Dodge minivan. Does anybody grow up with a minivan? Probably my kids did. They hated every moment of being in one. But the Dodge minivan was actually a huge success story for Chrysler. And what it was is they had a chassis. They had an inventory glut of a certain size chassis, which was for one of their sedans. And they had too many of them. They weren't selling enough of these sedans, and they had too many chassis in inventory. So somebody over there at Chrysler said, hey, what if we put a different top on top of that chassis? Instead of the sedan that we've been putting on top, why don't we put something else on top? Maybe something more like a bus. Why don't we, a small little bus? And so they did, and it got traction right away. And then they started to put money into it and spend time marketing it. And pretty soon the minivan was born. So that's a subcategory.
Nice. Thank you for that answer. I'm going to skip around a little bit. What was the most difficult part of starting your own firm? I guess that could even be related to any business, right? What was the most difficult part of starting your own business?
Yeah, I think it's the pressure to have enough money to make payroll. I mean, that there is nothing more pressurizing to your brain than knowing that you have people who work for you and they count on you and their families count on you and you can't pay them. It's like, it's awful. It's so you're constantly, how am I going to make enough money to keep this business going, to keep these people working for me, to keep the lights on, you know, to keep the M&Ms in the jar or whatever it is that you've got. That's the hardest part.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Let's keep going here. Sorry, here we go. What do you think about the new normal being this hybrid work environment and people being a little more displaced geographically? This is a great one for you, Andy, since you've always been geographically hybrid your entire career. What do you think the outlook is for talent, funding, startups, business, and just general work life as these students, you know, graduate college and start looking for work or starting their own businesses?
Yeah, I think that we are now into a new way of working where this hybrid thing is going to be the norm. So, you know, I think that there will be offices that people go into, but not every company will require them. A lot of the big companies are deciding to get rid of a lot of their offices because you don't really need to be in an office. That said, human beings need to work with each other, and Zoom is not a great solution to that. So there will be gathering opportunities for people either at an office, or some companies that I know spend all of their money that they would have spent on rent on doing like a quarterly event. Before COVID, they would take the whole company somewhere for 2 or 3 days and do a big offsite meeting every quarter, stuff like that. But I think we're going to live in a hybrid environment because everybody can't afford to live in these big cities. That's the other thing. You know, we have to accommodate where people can afford to live.
Yeah. Andy, I didn't realize there were people asking questions in chat as well. So I know we're pushing up against time here, but I'm going to take at least 1 or 2 of the questions that are also in the chat room. Okay.
Okay, sure.
One of the questions that I think would be really relevant for everybody is, how did you get to a point? Oh, this is a great one. You get asked this a lot, even by your employees.
Okay.
How did you in your 20s get to the point of leveraging your way into rooms with such powerful people or important people or people of decision-making authority?
So it's all about adding value, and you have to figure out what are the assets that you have as a human being where you can add value. If you're 22 years old and you don't have any business experience at all, you cannot be giving people advice on business. But what you can do is you can ask a lot of questions that are smart, and you can bring in other parts of your experience and make the connections between that part of your experience and what you're trying to offer to someone. But really, it's all about value. And by the way, I should say one other thing. CEOs, and I've spent my life working with CEOs, they don't need another friend. They have plenty of friends. They do not need you to be a friend. They want to get something out of you that's of value, and they don't care whether they like you or you like them. That's an irrelevant thing. So a lot of young people spend too much time trying to suck up to CEOs to try to get them to like them. And it isn't about it's about adding value. So my whole thing is, if you should be adding value at every juncture in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes the easiest way to do that as a young person is by asking smart questions. So you need to be adding value all the time. And if you disappeared from a meeting and you weren't missed, that's a big problem.
Great answer. I love that. And it's the same answer you give your team. So it's a very authentic answer, and I can vouch for that to the students here. It's a very genuine answer that she constantly and directly tells her staff as well. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out with two last questions. Okay, and I just wanted to make sure that these questions, we got some of the student questions from the team, but I do want to make sure we get some more like thoughtful and kind of advisory answers from you before we let you go. So I would love to know if you could go back and tell your 20-year-old self three things. What three things would you tell your 20-year-old self?
Oh my God, that's a great one. You know what I think the first most important thing I would say is don't stress so much. Don't stress out so much, because all these things are temporary. You know, every crisis that you're facing, every deadline you're facing, it's a temporary thing. You do the best you can, and then just don't get yourself in a knot, because I would get myself in a huge knot over things that I couldn't solve. So that would be thing number one. Thing number two, I think would be, you know, it really is about the people that you work with and the difference that you can make with them. So that's another huge thing. It's not about making the gazillion dollars, or, you know, a few people make a gazillion dollars. They're lucky. Woohoo, that's great. But not most people don't. So it's really about making a difference and adding value. Oh, the third thing is have a great partner in life. It makes your life a lot better, a lot more fun, a lot easier. And I have a great partner.
Is he sitting right there on the other side?
No,
of the
he's not. I think he's,
okay.
I think he's down.
I was just teasing you. All right, then to close us out, in the theme of Thanksgiving being next week, I'd love for you to share with the students, what are you thankful for this year?
Wow. Well, maybe this is a selfish thing to say, but I am super grateful for my children. My two kids. I have a wonderful daughter, McKinley, and a wonderful son, Cormac, and they both work for me, and they're amazing. And I can't tell you how grateful I am that they are working with me, and what it feels like to be a parent, to have your children working with you when you thought for most of your life that they hated what you did for a living. It's just, I can't, every day it's a miracle to me, and I'm so grateful for that. So that's gotta be number one.
Awesome. Thank you for being our fireside chat guest today and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with SJSU. Those are all my questions, and I'll pass it back to Professor Anu to close us out.
Thank you, Young. That was fun.
That was really fun. Oh, Professor, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm so grateful to both of you for coming, Andy and Young, and speaking with us. And I learned so much myself. And so it was a lot of fun. I'm sure the same goes for all the students and all my colleagues who are on. So thank you so much to both of you. Thank you to David for reaching out to you, Andy, and getting you to speak to all of us. And thank you to the students who are helping, Vamsi and Amer and everyone in the audience. So really happy, and happy Thanksgiving too.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you, Anu. Thank you, David. And thank you, Young. You guys are amazing. Thank you. I love what you're doing at SJSU. It's absolutely wonderful. And I also just want to give all you kids out there who are thinking about starting a company the encouragement to do it. Because there's no better journey to figure out who you are than starting a company.
Oh, beautiful way to close, Andy. Love it.
Absolutely. And thank you for saying you're going to give away a couple, 10 books.
That's right. I'm giving away 2 books. I don't know the formula for that, but yes, I'm going to sign them for 10 people.
Yeah, well, totally forgot. Thank you, Professor. Yeah, we're going to randomly pick 10 people, and we'll get you guys, we'll contact you and get you 10 signed books. Where Andy's giving away 10 signed books of her book. So I look forward to getting that as well.
All right. Well,
super. Well, thanks, you guys, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.